Hello, welcome to another video from the conscientious biologist, Ben Gallagher. This one's the second one in the body communication playlist, and it follows directly on from the first one, which looked at neurons and the nervous pathway. This one just fills in a couple of gaps to complete that section. It's from the GCSE specification, but there's not a lot more beyond this one in the A-level specification. So if you're doing A-levels, this would be a good starting point for that as well. As always, please do subscribe to my YouTube channel if you haven't done so already, but enjoy the video. Thank you. So let's start off by asking the obvious question of what is a synapse, and we're going to do this by pulling up something from the last video and looking at the nervous pathway. So you've got the sensory neuron here with its myelin sheath covered in those cells to give it its insulatory layers. At the far end of it, we've got the receptor cells from whatever receptor organ this sensory neuron is attached to, and when there's a stimulus, it stimulates the receptor organ to generate the action, the nerve impulse, and send the signal along to the end of the sensory neuron. Now the next thing that needs to happen is the signal needs to jump onto a relay neuron, because it's the relay neurons that make up the coordinator, and the coordinators can be the brain and spine. They're used for different functions, which we explained in the last video. The signal has to jump across that little gap that you can see to then carry on through the relay neuron to reach a motor neuron, so a signal can jump across that next little gap to make its journey along the motor neuron to eventually get to an effector, because it's the effector that will end up right at the end there causing the response. That's how you respond to any stimuli in your environment. It travels through this exact same pathway to cause a response. Now the synapses are these little gaps that we've said the signal needs to jump across. Now it can't just be a little sort of zapping like a bolt of lightning jumping across that gap. It's a little bit more complicated than that, and that's what we're going to look at in this video, because a synapse is the point at which two neurons meet and the message has to cross that gap. So let's look at how that happens. So this is called synaptic transmission. Now what I need you to think about for this slide is as if we've zoomed in on what I showed in those little pink circles on the last slide, the very end of one neuron and the very start of the next. So it's going to look like this. What we've got over on the far side over there is the pre-synaptic neuron, pre meaning sort of before, and synapse or synaptic cleft being the gap in between. So this is the one before and this is the one after, so it's the post-synaptic neuron. Now the reason why you use those terms pre-synaptic neuron and post-synaptic neuron is because there's two synapses. Now in the first synapse, the first gap, if you remember, the pre-synaptic neuron would have been the sensory neuron, and that would jump to the relay neuron. So you'd have sensory neuron and relay neuron. But in the second synapse, it's a jump from the relay neuron to the motor neuron. So to get around the problem of having to label them up separately or draw synapses twice, we just call them the pre and post synaptic neuron. Okay, the gap in between them is called the synaptic cleft, hence presynaptic neuron, postsynaptic neuron. Okay, so hopefully that makes sense what you're looking at. So let's look at how the process works here now. Now, in the end of the presynaptic neuron, you've got loads of little bubbles of membrane called vesicles. And in those vesicles is a very, very important protein called a neurotransmitter. Now, there's lots of different neurotransmitters that can work in slightly different ways and cause slightly different responses. But you don't need to worry about that. You just need to know there's these little vesicles, which is literally a tiny bubble of membrane that's full of these neurotransmitter proteins. Now remember, neurons are still just cells, so they need to make proteins because it's the proteins that will do everything for them. So in that cell, let's say it's a sensory neuron, in that cell, in the sensory neuron, ribosomes will have followed the instructions in the DNA to make these specific neurotransmitters and put them into the vesicles. It's still going back to that same thing about cells making proteins. So you've got these bubbles of neurotransmitter. Okay, now if a nerve impulse arrives at the end there, so it's gone whizzing down through the sensory neuron and it's got to the end, remember it's the same little star symbol I used on the last one. What that impulse is going to do is it's going to push those vesicles of neurotransmitter, and it's going to push them against the membrane right at the very end of the neuron, where they burst and release their neurotransmitter into the synaptic cleft. So those tiny little sort of cross-shaped stars, those are the neurotransmitter proteins. So the bubbles, literally, if that was the membrane, they get to the membrane, they burst at the membrane and release their proteins into the gap. Now link this up to stuff we did ages ago about transport through membranes and how molecules move around. Well, because they've been released at that side of the synaptic cleft, they're going to move across the synaptic cleft by diffusion, and they're going to hit those protein receptors. Those protein receptors will create a new nerve impulse, okay? And that will then just carry on along the postsynaptic neuron. So to go over the whole thing there, you've got an impulse arriving at the presynaptic neuron that forces the bubbles of neurotransmitter to burst into the gap, releasing their neurotransmitter, which floats across the gap by diffusion, remember, following a concentration gradient from high to low. That hits protein receptors on the postsynaptic neuron that were built by the postsynaptic neuron, following instructions in the DNA, built by the ribosomes, stuck on the membrane. Again, it's proteins doing everything. When the neurotransmitter proteins hit those receptor proteins cause a new impulse in the postsynaptic neuron, and the signal can just carry on. In other words, look at the two stars. It started over there and it's jumped across, and you've got a new impulse in the new one. Okay, take a screenshot of this, but on the next slide we're going to go through that point by point for how you might explain it in the exam. Okay, so let's pull up that same diagram here just as a reference point. But what I'm going to do, I'm going to put numbers onto the diagram as we go through one point at a time. So if I start over the far side there, we can say that that's a nerve impulse arrives at the end of the axon branch of a presynaptic neuron. 2, you can see the 2 popped up on the diagram. The impulse forces vesicles, keyword, of neurotransmitter into the membrane, so it's pushing them onto the membrane of the cell. Notice I put all of the keywords, the things that will be in the mark scheme of the exams, in blue. You've got to cram your answers with keywords or they're not going to be worth anything. Number 3 on the diagram over there, the vesicle transmitter into the synaptic cleft, another key term. Number 4, the neurotransmitters diffuse, key concept, across the synaptic cleft and bind to complementary. Remember, complementary means just like an enzyme's active site, they're kind of opposite shapes, but they lock together. So complementary membrane receptor proteins. Complementary meaning they're the right shape, they're on the membrane, they receive the neurotransmitter and their proteins. So 4 key words just in their name, complementary membrane receptor proteins. Okay, once that's bound to those, so at number 5, it triggers a new impulse at the start of a postsynaptic membrane. So you've got the whole description there. So in the exam, if it says, describe the events that happen at a synapse, there you go. 5 quick points, but crammed with keywords. Those are what you must include in there. So if we just pulled up the entire diagram now up above me, you can see how you could link the entire journey together, going right from stimulus to receptor, down the sensory neuron, down the axon branches. You can then describe all this, how it crosses a synapse, through the relay neuron, which acts as a coordinator, crossing another synapse using neurotransmitter, down a motor neuron, to an effector, to cause a response. You could describe the entire thing, and I suggest as a revision activity, you see if you can. Start with the stimulus and describe the entire pathway, but including the details of what happens at synapses. Okay, take a screenshot of this one because this is a really good description. Okay, we're going to finish up just by really focusing on 2 questions that come up a lot in the exams when it talks about the nervous pathway, because in the next video we're moving on to the brain. So in this one, we're talking about the reflex arc, but we're going to start with a question on sort of everything we've looked at in these first 2 videos. And that's, why are neurons so long? Or to phrase it another way, why not have lots of small ones joined by synapses? Why do I have a neuron that goes all the way from my big toe all the way up to my brain? That's one ridiculously long cell, when we've just proved that neurons can be linked together by synapses and cover the same amount of distance with loads and loads of much smaller cells. Well, there's an answer to that question, and it's speed. And it comes down to your understanding of what's happening in a neuron relative to what's happening in a synapse. So electrical impulses travel incredibly quickly through a neuron. They're literally like traveling at the speed of electricity, just zoom, okay? But diffusion is slow, and synapses are reliant on diffusion. So minimizing the number of synapses will increase the speed of nervous communication. What I mean by that, if you think you've got your sensory neuron, synapse, relay neuron, synapse, motor neuron. So if I'm doing that sort of by relative speed, we go zoom and then slowly diffuse, zoom, slowly diffuse, zoom. The slow bit are the two synapses. If you had loads of smaller neurons, you'd go zoom, slow, zoom, slow, zoom, slow, zoom, slow. Look how much longer it's taking me to move across the screen here. So it's a big, big advantage to minimize the number of synapses by having the minimum possible number of cells. One to go to the coordinator, one in the coordinator to deal with the information, and one to go back to the effector. That will keep the signal going really, really fast. Now that's especially important when we're talking about reflex responses. Remember in the last video, we talked about the voluntary thinking stuff that the brain does, but we talked about the spine doing the involuntary instant stuff, the reflexes, because reflexes are protective, whether it's pulling your hand away from something hot or your pupils constricting to stop light getting into your eye and blinding you. There's so many reflexes, but they're all instant and protective. You need them as fast as possible, or they're not going to protect you in time. Okay. Now, when we refer to the nervous pathway for a reflex, we call it the reflex arc. And I'm going to pull up a diagram now. This is literally pulled from an exam paper. But every year, this kind of diagram comes up, and some people get confused because they go, well, I don't even know what I'm looking at. So it's really important that I've shown you this, so if it comes up in your exam, you're at least familiar with it. Now what you're looking at here, that large lump, that's the spine, or specifically, it's a cross-section through a vertebrae, one of your backbones. The white bit on the diagram in that big lump, that's bone, that is the vertebrae bone. The grayer bit in the middle is the spinal cord. So that's what's made of all your relay neurons in there, okay? This bit slightly higher up here, this is the skin, and you'd be expected to recognize a skin cross section. Certainly when we come to do thermoregulation where the skin plays a bigger role, you'll see diagrams of that and hopefully it will become more familiar. But that's the skin, and this bit down the bottom here, that's a bit of muscle. That's some muscle cells, muscle fiber there that's connected. So hopefully now knowing that, looking at this diagram, you should be able to see that connected into the skin and coming down, look, and then down and along, there's a sensory neuron. You can even see the cell body, look, sticking out at the top of the sensory neuron, that bulge. The sensory neuron moves around there, and you can see there what I've just circled, there's the first synapse as it connects with the relay neuron that you can see traveling through the grey bit. You can see the second synapse there that I've just circled as it connects to the motor neuron, and the motor neuron coming back towards me and then curving round to link to the muscle, which is the effector. So hopefully that diagram makes sense. But in the exam, it might have that diagram and say, describe what's happening in this diagram, or describe the events in a reflex arc. So I'm going to give you a quick but full description of what's happening here. This is kind of what you should be writing in the exam. Okay. Now it might look like a big chunk, but it's really not. There's like 12 or 13 lines here, and they're very short lines. This might be 6 lines of writing for you. But just have a quick glance at it and notice how many things I've put in capitals. Those are all the key words that must be included that hit all the key information of a nervous pathway or a reflex arc. So it says, when a pin, which is what's shown at the top there now in the skin, when a pin acts as a stimulus, so you've got your first word in the nervous pathway, stimulus on the skin's receptors, an impulse travels down the sensory neuron, crosses a synapse using neurotransmitter, then on through the relay neuron of the spine, which acts as a coordinator, crosses a second synapse, on down the motor neuron that takes a signal to a muscle as the effector to cause a response to pull the hand away from the pin. Okay, was that 14, I think, keywords in there. So there's a huge amount of keyword information, but you really don't need to write much. And that's what you must practice for your exams, being able to write a chunk of information but packing it with the things that will actually be worth the marks, packing it with the details. Take a screenshot of this one because this covers most of the information. But that's it. We're finished with nervous pathway and reflex arcs. So the next video needs to look at something a little bit more specific. It's a very short video, the next one, and we're just looking at some of the key areas of the human brain and what they're responsible for. After that, we'll be looking at the eye in detail as a key receptor organ and how that can function with vision. So those are the next two videos, so head over to that one now. As always, I keep asking, please do subscribe to my YouTube channel if you haven't done so already. Give this video a like if you find it useful, and do head over to my Facebook page for a load of extra bits of biology that hopefully you'll find interesting. Thank you.